7 strings for acoustic guitar and its wooden shell to play folk so well. 3 strings for the bass, for fourth is not used unless it is for jazz to produce. 9 for the drums to play blues on the set, but they all were deceived, for metal was made. Hello you metal pilgrims and welcome to this very special episode. Not many of you know, but in addition to being a metalhead, I actually also happen to be a Tolkien fan. You wouldn't know that because I would never mention that in previous episodes, of course.
And I'm a Tolkien nerd. I'm not even a fan, I'm a nerd.
Okay, maybe once.
So Tolkien has been my passion.
Yeah, whatever. Anyways, I decided to combine the two passions of mine and explore the effect Professor's world had on the development of rock and metal. Hopefully answer the questions as per why that actually happens and why so many metalheads around the globe are so deeply influenced by the world of the Middle Earth. I'd like to say special thanks to the people of the Tolkien Society and Middle Earth groups on Facebook. Your submissions and your help has been absolutely tremendous for this particular project. And as always, before we start, I'd like to take a moment and invite you to join the conversation and subscribe to Metal Pilgrim channel on YouTube and join our communities on Instagram, Facebook, or any other social media you actually hang out at to submit your questions for all future interview guests, suggestions for the future episodes, and be the very first ones to find out what is inside future rock and metal releases. Here you go. I think you would agree with me that this project by itself is almost too broad to attempt. For example, during the research I found more than 800 rock and metal bands related to Tolkien in some way. 800. That's 800 bands. And in case you didn't hear that, that was 800. And thus just naming these bands and talking about them briefly would take me up to, 9 hours, and the episode itself would be utterly boring. On the other hand, being utterly boring is something I'm famous for, and I could have taken this to the next level. Maybe. In case you didn't know, there are 5 metal bands called Barad-dûr. Each and every one of them spelled differently. Anyway, so what I decided to do is to have one master episode in which we will be talking about the major influences in each one of the decades, started from the 70s and up till today. And then if there will be interest throughout the year, I will dig deeper into different bands and genres and analyze the lyrics and the musical composition of those in the future episodes. So please make sure you submit some of the bands you would like to be covered in the future episodes in the comments. Throw stones at me there, disagree, talk about how I mispronounce the Elvish names and stuff like this. I would really like to read those and understand whether this project actually makes sense for the future episodes. So, as I said, we will start from the 70s, because this is exactly when the hard rock actually developed the most, and the foundation for heavy metal and all the other metals, in fact, have been laid. And just like one cannot simply walk into Mordor, one cannot talk about the music of the 70s without talking about the arguably most influential band there was. Well, okay, Led Zeppelin. This London quartet is famous, among other things, for their love and obsession of Tolkien's work. The first appearance of the Tolkien Legendarium in their works was on the 1969 second album, Led Zeppelin 2, and the song Ramble On. In case you never picked up the reference to the worlds of Arda over there, the band gives a little hint in the lyrics.
Just in the darkest depths of Mordor, I met a girl so fair.
And so that nobody actually misses that reference or mishears it for something else, the band adds on.
But Gollum, the evil one, crept up and slipped away with her.
And while the reference is pretty clear, its meaning, just like the meaning of all Led Zeppelin songs, is quite vague. First of all, this song mentions a woman so far, and yet there is no love storyline between Frodo and any female in the book. And thus all we have to do is make an educated guess and speculate just a little. The obvious choice to go with would be to assume that the song is literally talking about Frodo's quest to destroy the One Ring. And in this case, the book's ring would be the woman in the song, and the events in the first line refer to Frodo realizing that he loves the One Ring in the heart of Mount Doom, and all that he wants is to possess it. The following line would then refer to this episode. That would be the obvious and the most logical explanation, but let's not forget that those guys wrote music in the 70s, and that means... So the song could actually be about anything, including an actual love story about a woman, and then any Tolkien reference would be used simply as a metaphor. Because they are Tolkien nerds, and that's what Tolkien nerds do. The band then kept clear of any Tolkien reference in their third album, and many might have thought, oh, finally those nerds are done. But then this album comes out. And just by reading the titles of some songs, it becomes clear that the band is back at it. The most obvious reference is, of course, in the Battle of Evermore. While the band does not name the places or characters the same way they did in the 1969 release, it is still pretty obvious that the track is about the final events of the return of the king. There are several thoughts as per who is the Prince of Peace, either Frodo or Aragorn, yet at the same time it is pretty clear that the Queen of Light who took her bow is of course Lady Galadriel, and the Ring Wraith who ride in black are the Ring Wraith who ride in black. Interesting fact about this song is that it is the only song Led Zeppelin ever recorded with a guest vocalist, Sandy Denny. In fact, they liked her so much that they gave her a symbol, just like the fifth member of the band, even though she wasn't an official band member. Then there's the song The Misty Mountains Hop. In case you weren't paying attention in the books or the movies, the Misty Mountains are the mountains in which Bilbo found the ring and several other events in the legendary took place. And yet the song is not about Middle-earth. It actually refers to the events of the 7th of July in 1968 and legalized pot rally in London. And so the band took the book's name, Misty Mountains, to describe a different kind of mist. You see, they, just like any modern Tolkien fan of the 21st century, would actually insert a Tolkien, a professor reference anywhere they could, even if they're simply talking about weed.
Old Toby, the finest weed in the South Valley.
Several hints to the Tolkien world have also been found in the legendary Stairway to Heaven. Plant sings about the lady who believes all that glitters is gold. And that line is derived from the famous Tolkien's All that is gold does not glitter, who in fact took it from Shakespeare's All that glisters is not gold. And Plant's spirit, which is crying for leaving while looking to the west, is suspiciously similar to that of Frodo, who is doing pretty much the same thing after the War of the Ring. And then in 1973, the band releases a song Over the Hills and Far Away, which derives its name from Tolkien's 1927 Over Old Hills and Far Away. We're not gonna go into the details on this one, just because on Tolkien's influence on Led Zeppelin alone, we could spend hours and hours of talking. So let's move this conversation into the comments and see whether we should dig deeper into it in the future episodes.
Write that down, write that down!
One thing I'd like to mention though, that Tolkien fans are so passionate about the professor's work is that sometimes they tend to see it even when there's no evidence of it. For example, this guy, many believe to be a character from Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. It is not. It is Hermit from the tarot cards. And the Immigrant Song is not about orcs invading elvish lands. Get over it. It's about Vikings. Yep.
What? What the fuck?
And while Led Zeppelin were huge, they were not the only band in the 70s, you know? The legendary Neil Peart of Rush, the drummer whom most of today's rhythm heroes call their influence, was in fact a Tolkien fan. He first showed his love for the Tolkien world in the 1975 release Rivendell, a song named after the elven city in which Elrond dwelt in the Third Age. Yet in this one, the band does not simply sing about the events of the book. They go much further than that. Neil uses Rivendell to describe a utopian place on which no dark powers have any effect. possibly referring to that of his own, the place in which you can dwell, leaving all your worldly troubles behind. And just a year later, the band releases a powerful track, The Necromancer, referring to Sauron during the events of The Hobbit, to counter that beautiful and peaceful imagery. It is a 12-minute long opus, which is divided into 3 parts, just like the publishers divided the Lord of the Rings books. And it is a much darker piece. The 70s overall marked a boom of hard rock and heavy metal, and those genres did not just rise by themselves. In addition to just being kick-ass music, they were and still are the soundtrack to the rebellious counterculture and a desperate yet very powerful cry for change. So how come it is that those rockers and metalheads found their inspiration in the works of this Christian writer? The answer lies in the ideals portrayed by Tolkien, which were very much resonating with the society's rising demand for change and are to this very day. Rise of protest against the imperialistic worldview, unnecessary wars, keeping a blind eye on the great evils of this world, and even on the rising materialistic culture in which we're all sucked into, all resonated with the early 70s ideas portrayed by the hard rock bands of that time. And thus the world of Middle-earth somehow opened the gates to the escapism to a better world for those guys. Pink Floyd's The Gnome, Uriah Heep's The Wizard, Camel's extensive piece Nimrodel, The Procession, The White Rider from their album Mirage, they all refer to Tolkien work in one way or another. And again, I'd love to dig deeper into these ones, so please make sure to leave your requests in the comment section below. And in addition to the above, hard rock laid the foundations for heavy metal, thus opening the gates to the heavier and sometimes much darker side of music. There is an old saying from the 80s which goes like this: Black Sabbath heavy, Judas Priest metal. Thus, in order to understand how that style of music has developed, we need to ask the legends. Keep in mind that all those boys grew up in pretty much the same neighborhood in the industrial city of Birmingham, England, full of factories. And it is there where they forged early heavy metal, just like Sauron forged the One Ring in the heart of Mount Doom. And both of those bands in multiple interviews throughout their 50+ year long career spoke about the influence the gloom of those factories has had on their minds and effectively on their music. And how in reality most of those factories should not have any place in the modern world. And this in fact is the key thread throughout the Tolkien's works. You see, the professor saw meaningless industrialization as a symbol of greed. And while he was in favor of the progress to better human lives, he did not agree that it should be done at the expense of nature and environment, and despised the concept of industrialization for the sake of industrialization.
The old world will burn in the fires of industry. Forests will fall.
And while we're on topic, Black Sabbath's Grammy nominee song The Wizard is in fact an ode to Gandalf.
Tell me.
Yes, many believed it being about a drug dealer who would go around the world in his funny clothes, turning tears into joy. But in the 2005 interview, the bassist Geezer Butler finally opened up about the meaning of this song, saying that it was simply a reference to the Wizard of the Middle-earth. And while the 70s laid the foundation, it was the 80s that were the most groundbreaking for heavy music. Tenths of genres were developing simultaneously, and some of the greatest bands of all times rose to fame during that decade. And of course, Tolkien's influence on those has been pretty strong. Yet, to be fair, if in the 70s it was the bands on the avant-garde of the genre who sung of Middle-earth, Tolkien-inspired bands and albums actually grew more in quantity rather than in quality in the 1980s.
Bro, what are you talking about, man?
You may disagree with me and start throwing stones at me in the comments, and don't get me wrong, there were some amazing bands who sung of the legendarium during that decade, yet their overall input on the development of the heavy music wasn't as significant as in the previous and the following decades. It is still worth pointing out some of the most influential ones, though, including progressive band Marillion, founded by Mick Pointer and Doug Irvin, and which was first called The Silmarillion. It was during their first concert on March 1st, 1980, that they decided to shorten their name. Another important band would be Sirith Ungol. Those American guys derived their name from the mountain path in Middle Earth.
I walk the roads of mystery. It's each me, but too soon.
Yet in the works of the professor, it was pronounced as Kirith Ungol, while the guys decided to make it a little bit easier for American audience to pronounce and call it Sirith Ungol instead. Robert Garvin and Greg Lindstrom, the founding members, actually met during an English class where the teacher was reading Lord of the Rings. And the only other band names they were considering at that point were band names like Minas Tirith, Khazad-dûm, or Uruk-hai, so basically anything Lord of the Rings related. But they landed on Sirith Ungol and have been humorously called Sarah's uncle and Sirius Uncool by the guys who didn't share their affection of fantasy. Speaking of which, the band actually kept it in their lyrics throughout the career. Their first album was what is considered to be a classic American power metal album, whatever that means. On their second release, though, they started leaning towards a darker and more heavier sound, thus stepping into the dark side of the heavy metal music and leaning towards, doom metal. In fact, after a 25-year-long split, the band reassembled recently and released a pretty strong album in 2020, so you make sure to check it out if you haven't yet. The other band from the decade which left their mark on the development of the genre was this death metal band from Germany called Cadaverous Smell, formed in 1985. A terrible name! And so later that year they decided to switch their name to Minas Morgul. Okay, that's better. And then settled on Morgoth, the name taken by Melkor, Sauron's master, after destroying the two trees of Valinor. The band has become extremely popular among the death metal fans around Europe, yet sadly announced their second and so far final breakup in 2020. Not everybody knows, but the original storyline of Voivod's Nuclear Vampire has been heavily influenced by Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, in addition to Bram Stoker's Dracula and Bob Morane's Le Talisman de Voivode.
You're not speaking French!
Although it has been significantly veiled, and the only resemblance can be easily found in the planet's name, Morgoth. I think I just explained who he is, so I'm not gonna do that again. But I had a pleasure of welcoming Michelle Whalen-Javin, the man behind that story, on the show a couple of weeks ago. So if you haven't done so yet, make sure to check out that episode. We, among other things, spoke about the possibility of bringing the original character Voivod back to life. And those are just some of the bands. ARC, Anyone's Doctor, Archangel, Attacker, Avalon. Those are just 5 metal bands on the letter A inspired by Tolkien, who produced their material in the 80s. And there are tenths more, of course, yet most of those, except for the above and maybe Fate's Warning with their Shadowfax, did not leave any mark on heavy metal and could easily be skipped. Of course, I could spend, a couple of hours talking about those bands, but it is not the matter of this particular episode. And then the 90s came and all the shit got loose. You see, the 80s became extremely fruitful for thrash and death metal, and most of the attention, in addition to traditional new wave of British heavy metal, has been dedicated to those genres. But they all were deceived, for another genre was made.
One ring to rule them all.
The mix of the above formed black metal, and it is black metal bands who took the obsession with Tolkien metalheads had to an absolutely new level.
My precious.
Precious? It's been called that before, but not by you.
You see, at this point, there were some bands on the forefront of the genre who would not only include a song or two to show their affection of the Middle Earth, they would build their entire careers on the works of Professor. Especially those who did not want to be associated with the anti-religious message, usually, tied to the black metal scene. Keep in mind also that at this point there were no Peter Jackson movies, so it was much harder to be a casual Tolkien fan. You would actually have to go out there and read the books. And if you have done so, I think you will agree with me that those will suck you in and will make you want to dig deeper and explore the world more and more. And thus writing a meaningful album or two on the Legendarium would require a significant amount of research by the band. And possibly the most prominent of those is Summoning. This Austrian avant-garde black metal band formed in 1993, who never ever played a live show in their lives, produced 8 albums up to date, and became one of the most renowned black metal bands of all times. In fact, they were the first band whose genre, in addition to being black metal, has been described as Tolkien metal, for the obvious reasons. The band's first studio album, Lugburs, was a classic black metal album and is much different from Summoning's later work. And while the band has not found its original sound yet, the Legendarium content was already there. Starting from the album title, which is the black speech name for Barad-dûr, the watchtower of Mordor and the stronghold of Sauron during the Second and Third Ages. The line was then continued in the lyrics of the songs, yet to be honest with you, they felt somewhat disconnected from the music. What? You see, traditional black metal is a bit too rough around the edges, and for my personal taste, I believe that there should be a certain atmosphere developed to be able to fit the Legendarium into the music, especially if the band's intention is to sing not only about the dark land of Mordor. And this is exactly what the band has done on their second release. The 1995 Minas Morgul marks the beginning of Tolkien metal. The band added so much needed epicness to its sound, developing a proper atmosphere to go with the lyrics. By now, all the layers of music, including, the synth sounds, the guitars, the, masterful rhythm section, and a very profound one, by the way, they all worked in synergy. And together with the lyrics, painted a vivid image of Orda and the events of the Legendarium. And just by looking at the song's titles, it becomes clear that the guys are no, casual admirers of Tolkien's world. They do have a profound understanding of the complex history of Orda. For example, Morgoth is the name of the river in Gondor, and I don't think that anyone except for the die-hard Tolkien fans would get that. The song Ungoliant, which is of course about the dark spider of the First Age, also mentions a Zelahar, the green mound near the western gates of Valmar. The name derived from Valarin, the language of Ainur, and the amount of research you actually had to do to reference that is absolutely incredible. I'm not going to go into the details, but there are also mentions of the battles of Dagor Bragollach, the Battle of the Sudden Flame, the fourth great battle in the War of the Jewels, Dor Guldur, Dor Daedalus, and many, many more. And this is exactly why Summoning are considered to be the pioneers of Tolkien metal. While they weren't the very first black metal band to reference Tolkien, they took this obsession to an absolutely new level. For example, we can take a look at formed in 1989 black metal band Isengard, formed as a side project of Fenris, the drummer of Darkthrone, which, of course, derives its name from the Legendarium. Even more, the original art featured the evil Maya Thranduil, the vampire who served both Sauron and Morgoth throughout the ages. But that was about it for their lyrics. They stopped there at the name. Overall, the idea of deriving names from the Legendarium became somewhat of a tradition for many bands of that decade. Norwegian Gorgoroth, referring to the plateau in Mordor, Burzum, which can be translated as darkness from the Black Speech, and hundreds of other bands, especially in Europe, all named themselves in a Tolkien manner, including one of my personal favorite melodic death metal bands of all times, Amon Amarth, which is, of course, the Mount Doom in Sindarin, But that was about it for them. Then they started exploring their Nordic roots and telling the tales of Vikings and invasions. And while we're on topic, wanted to suggest that for a very long time, their cue to enter the stage song probably should be Led Zeppelin's Immigrant Song. Just saying. And of course, there were some more discreet references, such as that of Dimmu Borgir's, whose frontman's name was Shograth, a play on the orc captain's name from Cirith Ungol, the tower, not the band. And I guess only the true Tolkien nerds would be able to pick that up. And so far we covered only black and death metal, and of course just a couple of the bands from the 90s, but it wasn't always the side of the enemy and the darkness which was portrayed by the metalheads of the decade.
There's some good in this world, Mr. Frodo. And it's worth fighting for.
And among dozens and possibly hundreds of bands around the globe who were basing their material on the works of Professor, there were some who were so influential that they actually inspired entire generations of bands after the millennium. And one of them is indisputably Nightwish. While the band wasn't basing all of their lyrics of the Tolkien legendarium, yet at the same time some of their greatest hits, especially of the Tarja Turunen, the best era, reference Tolkien for sure. For example, their anthem song, Wish Master, references Lorien, which is of course Lorien, and Albereth. For those of you who missed that one as well, Albereth is the Sindarin name for Vala Varda, one of the most beloved Valas for elves and Frodo, whose name is often referenced in The Lord of the Rings, The Silmarillion, and a gazillion other books as well. The other song from the same album, which was by the way called Wishmaster, Crownless, also takes several lines from the poem All That Is Gold Does Not Glitter, referenced earlier in this episode. And that's about it for Nightwish. Oh wait, there was another take on Over the Hills and Far Away, but that song actually had nothing to do with Tolkien. So why is that so many people considered Nightwish to be a Tolkien metal band? The reason for that is twofold. First is that those songs are so definitive of the Nightwish sound, and they are the ones who actually brought the band popularity that many actually associated their career with Wishmaster. And the second one is that Symphonic Metal, and that of Nightwish in particular, goes so well with the legendarium that at some point you can actually close your eyes and imagine yourself being the part of the fairy stories of the Tolkien. And to be honest with you, Nightwish actually did their part in popularizing Tolkien works among their followers. It is indisputable that Nightwish is one of the most influential symphonic metal bands of all time, and possibly the most influential female-fronted one. And therefore, it had gazillions of followers after the millennium, who, in their part, actually dug deeper than Nightwish did into the legendarium. And we'll take a look at them in just a minute. But before we move to after the millennium, there is one more album that we have to mention. And if someone would actually ask me for the most influential, the most quintessential Tolkien metal album of all times, I would actually have to go with that one. Blind Guardian's Nightfall in Middle-earth is one of the most musically complex, thought-through, and groundbreaking legendarium albums of all times. It is comprised of both songs and the spoken words, and tells the tale of the War of the Jewels described in the Silmarillion and these books in particular. In case you were ever wondering who is depicted in the album cover, it is of course Morgoth with his black crown and jewels, and Luthien dancing in front of him, whose tale is so wonderfully described in Beren and Luthien. In fact, Tolkien loved this story so much that his and his wife's Edith's gravestones actually say Beren and Luthien. This concept album describes the War of the Jewels, ending with a 5th grade battle and a complete defeat of the Noldor, and thus Middle-earth fallen into the darkness under the reign of Morgoth. And the entire atmosphere created by Blind Guardian's music, spoken word, and lyrics all work together in great synergy to paint this vivid image and describe the events of those dark times, started with the War of Wrath, the fall of Gondolin, and the love stories as well. In addition, the lyrics are extremely profound and tell the tale without paraphrasing or, quoting professors' words. You actually have to think and dig deep into the lyrics to understand what each song is all about. For example, my favorite one is Mirror Mirror, which tells the story, I believe, of the fall of Gondolin, the hope that lies in the west, the wrath, the love story, just everything all together. And the song's title, which bothered so many, actually has a very logical explanation. I'll be honest with you, I've been listening for this song for years, and every time it just drove me crazy because I could not understand what Mirror Mirror was all about. Yet at the same time, after I read it, it was simply eye-opening. And thus overall, this record is not only a classic example of epic power metal that inspired so many bands around the globe, and especially in Europe, to pick up their musical instruments and produce tunes of their own. It is a crucial piece of a puzzle and a pillar, if you will, of the Tolkien legacy and its sub-creation. Since we're now talking about the 21st century, I got a confession to make. I am one of those guys who still believes that the 90s were 10 years ago. Yeah, I know there were 2000s, then 2010s, and I guess we're in the 20s now, but it's very hard for me to distinguish them in my head. And therefore, when, deciding how to structure this episode better, I decided to simply analyze the bands after the 2000s of the 21st century. And here's the reason why. You see, the bands in the 70s were the first of their kind. They were the conquistadors. They were the explorers. They had no foundation to build upon. They just, started exploring the legendarium and hard rock and heavy metal and build upon it. The 80s band already had those, to use as the reference. Yes, there was a huge boom in the different genres, and therefore they could incorporate Tolkien's work in those genres as well. The 90s then had all the above, plus the accessibility of information. And this is when, the boom of the Tolkien metal bands actually happened. And then came the 2000s. And especially 2001. And in addition to the accessibility of information and the World Wide Web of the internet, when, all the books became available in just a moment all around the globe, Peter Jackson movies came out. And you may like them or not, but it is them who brought the Tolkien culture to the mainstream, especially for the Millennium kids. And therefore, if before to be a Lord of the Rings fan, you actually had to be a nerd and a geek, now it is normal. And now everyone knows what Lord of the Rings is, who Tolkien is, who are the hobbits, and what a flip is going on, in the Middle Earth. All of the above, in addition to the rebirth of heavy metal overall, resulted in unprecedented rise of popularity of Tolkien metal bands. And if before it was mostly black metal and power metal and a bit of hard rock who were influenced by the genre, now you had Tolkien-related representatives in each one of those. Hard rock, heavy metal, thrash metal, symphonic metal, even stoner metal, anything you want to choose from. In addition, the geography of those bands widened widely. If before we were talking mostly about Europe and a bit of the United States, now you have Latin American bands, you have Asian bands, you have African bands, you even have a Middle Eastern Tolkien-related band. And thus I think you would agree with me that naming each one of those would be a bit of a boring job to do at this point. And naming the influence that they had or something like this, it actually wouldn't make any sense unless we would dive deeper into their musical composition. And therefore, I'll mention briefly just a couple of bands who, in my humble opinion, are the most influential or the most interesting ones. Remember how I said before that Nightwish with their music inspired the entire generation of bands across the globe? Well, there's one of them, actually their country-made band, called Battlelore, that deserves the most attention. These guys from Finland, who play an absolutely weird mix of styles, which includes heavy metal, power metal, symphonic metal, melodic death metal, and folk metal, actually based their career entirely on the works of Tolkien. Their first album, Where Shadows Lie, in 2001, I think it was received extremely well, and they immediately caught the attention of one of the largest record labels in Europe, Napalm Records, and releasing, several consecutive albums after that. Unfortunately, they broke up in 2011, I think, yet reassembled in 2016, and I actually know that they are currently working on a new album, which may be or may not be out this year. And actually, if you've never heard their music, I would actually encourage you to go on Spotify, Apple Music, Deezer, YouTube Music, or anywhere else you listen your music to these days, and give them a try. And by the way, if you do like any of the bands I suggested in this particular episode or any other episodes you watch on the channel, please make sure you actually support the bands during these hard times. Now, they, like the entire music industry, is suffering a lot from the coronavirus and from everything that is going on, around the globe right now. And thus, giving them your dollar or euro or a hryvnia, whatever your currency is, actually, helps them out a lot.
Shut up and take my money!
Another interesting and rather unexpected, to be honest with you, reference to the Tolkien world was that of the Swedish power metal band Sabaton. But Sabaton is not a Tolkien metal band, you would say. They are a historical band, and you're absolutely right. And that's exactly why it's very interesting. You see, the Tolkien fans actually consider the history of Middle-earth as an actual history. They refer to the Silmarillion and the History of Middle-earth books as actual historical documents. They're not crazy, by the way, it's just because we are so immersed into the idea and the culture of it is that sometimes you blur the lines. And thus, hearing the reference to Mordor in the song Shadows by a band who specializes in actual historical events was really unexpected and really interesting to me personally. Just one more to wrap it up would come actually from Italy. And it's interesting because, most of the bands would actually reference the Legendarium, referring to the elves, the Gondor, and stuff like this, or sometimes the Hobbits even. But this band actually built their entire career around the race of dwarves. And it is the Italian power metal band Windrose. I actually had a pleasure of speaking to the frontman Francesco Cavalieri a couple of months ago. I think it was during the last summer, and we, among other things, actually spoke of the Tolkien influence on their work and where they might take the story in their future albums. So if you haven't yet, make sure to check out that episode. It's a pretty fun one to watch. And just to say it again, there are many more bands, possibly hundreds. Karakangan, Underoath, Numenor, and many other bands around the world, all are influenced by the Tolkien world. And I hope that this particular episode would be a starting intro point to us discovering this world together, seeing how Tolkien influences metal, how he did that in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and how he's doing this today, and predicting maybe how he will do that in the future. Because I personally believe that, the Amazon series, which are about to roll out pretty soon, we know that for sure, actually will spur another wave of interest for the Legendarium. And thus, I would love to hear your feedback, not only on this episode overall, because I know you will throw stones at me over here, but also submit some bands, submit some ideas and interesting facts which you would want to dig deeper, possibly together, and explore in the future episodes throughout the year. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and any other social media. This would actually really make me happy and help me out. Keep rocking.